Hello and welcome to the next session of Metacosm. This is going to be session 9, where we're going to talk about all the book 9's in the Bible. The history book is 1 Samuel, where the kingdom age begins, and the prophetic book is Obadiah, talking about the judgment on Edom, and the apostolic book is 2 Thessalonians, talking about the Antichrist desecrating the temple. And without further ado, let's just jump right in. Okay, so as I said, these are all the book 9's in the Bible. And so this is the Hebrew letter for the number 9, Tet, the Tet books. And it's covering the period that we call the tribulation, Revelation chapter 6, verse 1 through Revelation 18:24, which is also known as the 70th week of Daniel and the 7-year tribulation period. So in 1 Samuel, it's the book of the beginning of the kingdom age. The kingdom age starts actually at the rapture of the church, or right after the rapture of the church. There's a crowning ceremony in heaven. Of course, Jesus is already king, but the world at large hasn't accepted him as such, or accepted him as king, and Israel as a nation certainly has not accepted him as king. So the kingdom age on the earth actually starts out in a very bad position, because it's going to be the tribulation period with a false king. And so just like the prefigure of history has been perfect up to this point, you're going to see that 1 Samuel is yet future. So just like Ruth is yet future, it prefigures the rapture of the church. 1 Samuel prefigures the beginning of the kingdom age here on earth. So what happens in 1 Samuel is we have to remember first that 1 Samuel, the first 10 chapters, still take place during what is the very last stage of the Judges stage. The Judges stage of history. And so this is the time when, in the modern application, the church has had victories and has had lulls, ebbs and flows, defeats, victories, going back into complacency, where God allows bondage and other things to come in to get the church back in line. And then, of course, great revivals and great victories where the church grows and magnifies, and many more new believers get saved, and so on. So that has all been happening for the past 1,988 years, since the time of the Acts of the Apostles, really the Acts of the Holy Spirit. And we have all of those things have happened throughout history. So now we have, in the time of Israel's history, the actual book of Judges recounts that exact same time in Israel's history, where they had victory, where they took possession of the land, but then they got complacent and their enemies took back some of their possession and some of their inheritance, and then God would send revival through a spirit-filled leader that would heroically help them to defeat their enemies, and then they'd get back on track for a little while, and they'd have peace for a period of time, like 40 years as an example, and then that leader would pass away, and then they'd get complacent again, and their enemies would take hold and encroach upon them again, and it would just go through that cycle. Well, at the very end of the cycle, we have two things happen. The book of Ruth, first of all, which is the picture of the Gentile bride being married to her Jewish or Hebrew kinsman redeemer. And in the book of 1 Samuel, we see that the first 10 chapters are still under Samuel, who actually is the very last judge. Samuel is the last judge. So during a little bit after that time of the book of Ruth, you have Samuel operating there, and he actually chooses, by God tells him to anoint and choose King Saul, because the people of Israel were unfaithfully begging for a king, because they wanted to be like all their surrounding neighbor nations who were all under kings. And so here's the account of that in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. So they're trying to figure out a succession of how the judges are going to continue on. And so they think, since there's no good sons from Samuel, that instead of consulting with God and to see what he wants, they demand that Samuel, who is their last judge, appoints a king to rule over or judge them like all the other nations. The thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. And that's exactly what is going to happen again. So this happened in the past, in the development of Israel's history, back then in 1 Samuel, and it's exactly what's going to happen again. Right now, Israel wants to be like all their surrounding nations again, and they have since 1948. They wanted to have a democratic republic like all the other big successful nations of this age. They want to have a Senate, they want to have a representative republic, they have their Knesset, they want to have a president, and so on and so forth. So they want to be like all the other nations. Only thing is, with these democratic republics, as we're seeing right now, we're seeing that the powerful and the wicked are ultimately going to take control of those types of governments, and they already are. And so we see right now that in Israel, they've already had 3 elections, and they're going into a 4th election. They're deadlocked, they're in gridlock, and we are going to very soon see emerge, well, hopefully we as the church, of course, won't see, we might see the beginnings of it, but as we're seeing right now, but we are going to be out of here, and then the person who's going to take control actually is going to be appointed by God. God has ordained and appointed it because they've rejected him, and so he's going to allow this false king to come on the scene. And so we had in the book of 1 Samuel, you actually have Saul, who is a type or a model or foreshadowing of the actual Antichrist himself. So that's what we see. Saul is a picture or model or type of the Antichrist. That's what we see in the book of 1 Samuel. And that's the kind of the macrocosmic big picture view. And then there's also another type or model of the Antichrist who, at the very end, who actually kind of carries over into 2 Samuel just for the first couple of chapters, Ishbosheth, who is Saul's son. And his name means the man of shame, or the defiled man. And he also, before that, in 1 Chronicles chapter 8, he's referred to as Ishbaal, meaning the man of Baal. And Baal, we have to understand, we know it's a false pagan god of fertility, you know, the male fertility god, Baal. But you have to understand that the way they used the word Baal just meant simply Lord. So when we use the word God or Lord generically, there's a lot of people in our society that are using God as a generic term or Lord as a generic term, and they don't necessarily mean the Lord God, Yad-Heh-Vav-Heh, or Yahweh, and they don't mean Jesus Christ. So we have to be very careful when we use these terms, because we know Baal is a very, very bad and wicked thing, and was a wicked false god, but when they were using it back then, that word simply meant Lord. So they could very cleverly get away with talking about God and Lord when they really meant their Lord, who was Baal, who was a false god, a principality, a satanic force. So Ishbaal, that might have been saying, like, back to, in their ears, back in that time, they might have thought of Ishbaal as being, oh, it's a man of the Lord. But we know which Lord he was a man of, the Lord of darkness. So you have to be careful with your terms. That's why it's important when we're talking about God and when we're talking about Christianity. When we use terms like God and Lord, we must make sure that we are always cognizant of the fact that we should qualify that by saying we're talking about the Lord Jesus Christ and the God of heaven and earth, the one true God, Yod Heh Yahweh, Jehovah God, Jesus Christ. That's who we're talking about, so that we don't mince words and make anybody confused over who we're talking about when we say those words. Okay, but Saul's son is Ishbosheth, and he is actually the man of shame, the defiled one, the man of Baal, the wicked one. Saul's like a greater picture of, in the book order, he's a greater picture of the Antichrist, the ruler who seems good at first, who then becomes the one who's actually against God and God's people and against God's true king. All right, so let's look at the book um, of Obadiah. This is the shortest book in the Old Testament, and it's very interesting because it's just one chapter, and it's all about an Edomite who profanes God's holy mountain. So if you read the passage here in Obadiah, verse 15, for the day of the Lord draws near on all the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head, because just as you drank on my holy mountain, all nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow and become as if they had never existed. God proclaims against this wicked one. And so some people, Stephen Van Noon did a piece on this. For those of you familiar with him, he did a piece on this a couple of years back, showing that Pope Francis is actually, he believes, is the one who fulfilled this, because he went and he had a communion service kind of against the will of Israel. He kind of strong-armed his way into, having an upper room communion service there in Jerusalem, and drank on his holy mountain in an unacceptable way, trying to claim authority over Jerusalem. And that happened back, I think, in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. You can go look it up. And then, of course, the book of 2 Thessalonians is the famous book of the Antichrist's abomination coming to fruition. So the Antichrist desecrates the temple, demanding to be worshipped as God himself, where it says, let no one in any way deceive you, for unless the departure, and yes, I am going to use the word departure here, not falling away or apostasia. We'll talk about that in a minute. Comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Now, why do I use the word departure here? I have great justification for doing this. Some people will argue apostasia means falling away or departure from the faith. You can go find the very first English translations of the Bible before King James, even Tyndale. When they got to this verse, they did translate it departure, because apostasia in the Greek literally means denotatively departure. Now, it has taken on a connotation over the years of specifically being a specific type of departure, a departure from sound doctrine, a departure from true and correct teaching, a departure from correct, holy, godly living. And it can be used that way. Apostasia can be used that way. It certainly has translated into English bearing that connotation. If we say apostasy in English, we all know what we mean. It means a great defilement of the standard, straight and narrow Orthodox teachings and practices that are supposed to be practiced. And that connotation does come with it. And so those who argue against the word departure being used as a way of talking about the rapture, granted, they have an argument there. However, what they always fail to consider, and this is something that they never answer, I've never heard anybody answer this argument correctly. If it's talking about the apostasy, the great falling away, they always say, well, it's not going to happen until the great falling away happens. Okay, well, when was that? When is the great falling away? And they'll always talk about, well, it's happening now. Well, how do you define that then? How do you define the great falling away as happening right now? Or how do you define it? We could say that there's been an apostasy since Paul talked about his departure. Many wolves would come in and start, devouring the flock. So is that when the falling away began? What about in 325 when the church married the state? Is that when the falling away happened? What about in 600 AD when all kinds of pagan practices and apostasies of that nature came onto the scene? What about the time, the Roman Catholic Church might very well teach this as being the time when Martin Luther came and took and segmented the church and had the schism there, or the schism that happened in the 11th century. You could talk about that schism. They could say that that was the Great Departure, or we could say the Great Departure, the Great Apostasy, the Great Departure from the faith was when megachurches started, or when abortion was legalized in the United States and throughout most of the world at that point, subsequent to that. Or we could say that the Great Falling Away was when this happened or when that happened. In other words, the point being, or we could say the Great Falling Away is happening right now. Okay, well, if that's the case, it's a meaningless term. It's a meaningless term because this is a chronological sentence. It's a chronological sentence saying that something has to happen first, then something else will happen later. So this thing that's been happening for 1,988 years has to happen first. How do we ever know when it's over? There's always going to continue to be falling away and falling away and falling away. There's been falling away from the sound doctrine for centuries. And then there's a revival, and then we get back on track, and then there's another falling away. And then there's revival, and we get back on track, then there's another falling away. So how do we know when the apostasy happens? It's impossible to know. There's been horrible, despicable things that have happened through the church all through history. Was it when, was the falling away when the despicable facts of the pedophile nature of the Roman Catholic Church and many factions of it, many aspects of it, has come to light over the past few decades and been exposed and been brought to some measure of justice? Was that the Great Falling Away? Or when? When does it ever end? When does the Great Falling Away ever end when we can say, that's the moment when it actually happened? You can't, because this is a chronological statement. That's why in the first English translations they used the word in its denotative sense, departure, indicating once the rapture happens, it will be a clear and distinct event, a chronological event, which can happen first, then the Antichrist can be revealed. Makes much more sense that way. Trying to make it a falling away of the church is vague, undefinable, and you never know when it's finished. And so I will rest my case on that. So you can talk about all the apostasy in the church all you want right now. It's been there for centuries, been there for millennia. And is it getting worse? Yes, but there's times when it gets better and there's pockets of revival. So you can't ever define a single event when it happens. But when the departure, the rapture happens, that is a single chronological event, and it will be defined, and it will demarcate this chronology. And that's why this word is much, much better. All right, so let's go ahead and look at some of the rest of this. Here we have Saul chosen as a king for Israel. It's someone Israel thought they wanted, just like in the near future, Israel's going to think they want the Antichrist. Why? Because he's head and shoulders above the rest. He seems very nice, humble, peace-loving leader who was valiant in battle against Israel's enemies, but he actually ended up being an enemy to God's true king, King David, and King David's followers. The prefigure is clear. Israel in their current modern manifestation wants to be like all the other nations, like I already said. They want to have democracy, a senate, representative government, but ultimately this is going to lead to bringing in who they believe will be their Messiah, their Saul, and he's actually going to end up being the Antichrist. Okay, so the book of Obadiah, the prophetic book, I believe this will be the bloodline, partially of the bloodline of the false prophet. And this is why. Okay, the battle between the spirit and the flesh was embodied in the womb of Rebekah, who carried the twins, Jacob, who became Israel, and Esau, who became Edom. Esau was firstborn, as we are all born in the flesh first. Yet Jacob was secondborn, prefiguring the born-again spiritual nature. And of course, Jacob, we know, took supremacy over Esau in their natural lives, and the two nations that formed from them have been waging war ever since. All throughout the Old Testament, you see Edom and Israel are opposed to one another. They're diametrically opposed to one another. And the genealogy of the false prophet in Revelation 13, it's a subject of much debate, but it would certainly be fitting if the false prophet's lineage included a strong portion of Edomite bloodlines, because that would certainly be prophetically fitting. And you can go see a hint of this, a prefiguring hint of this in the Gospels, as the Herods, the Herodians, were in fact Idumeans, which is a Greek term that basically connotes the Edomites, the people from Edom, who were prevalent in the Roman Empire. And of course, we know that Herod the Great, he pretended like he was a Jew. He pretended he abstained from eating pork, and he did other things like that. In fact, it was said of him that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son, because he had his sons executed for fear of them assassinating him to take his power, his position of power. So it was a mess family. There's 6 Herods mentioned in the New Testament. They're all related to one another, either, their grandfather, father, uncle, cousins, types of different types of Herods that are mentioned throughout the Gospels and the book of Acts. And of course, those Herods, and there was more than those that were mentioned in the Bible, but those particular ones were mentioned in the Bible, 6 of them. And they were a wicked people. All of them were wicked. Yet they liked to be seen as being magnanimous, glorious, gracious, spiritually minded type leaders who were very, they would be like our modern day version of virtue signaling. They said all the right things so they could seem good, but they were really inherently wicked internally. And so it would, in fact, be very fitting if there was a one world religion pope who was from Roman descent, and that Roman descent was Idumean or Edomite. That would be very fitting prophetically for the culmination of this battle between the spirit and the flesh, giving the Antichrist a fleshly minded, quote unquote, spiritual leader. In other words, remember, it's going to be a duo, a political leader, the Antichrist, and the false prophet, who's a false spiritual leader. Ecumenical, for sure. Okay, so, and then here we see in the ultimate reality of this in 2 Thessalonians, what seems good in the natural versus what is good in the eternal is the constant battle all Christians must struggle with. The Bible prophesies a time when this struggle will come to its ultimate breaking point during the tribulation, of which we already see very long shadows being cast over our present reality from that future time, at least at the time of this video. Okay, with corporations, businesses, organizations, agencies, and others now being compelled across the world to deny public accommodation services to those who refuse to subjugate themselves to the global elite's strongly encouraged suggestions, it's a new form of tyranny that is emerging. These suggestions end up becoming, in effect, mandates without ever becoming laws. So everybody should understand that any president, any governor, any mayor, any person who's ruling over a municipality, if they make an executive order or an emergency order, that order is not law. It is not something that's been passed by a legislature. It is something that they do temporarily to enforce, to try to get something that they want to do going with an executive order. However, over time, you typically see any executive order that infringes on people's civil rights, civil liberties. It's challenged in court, and usually those things get struck down in the long run. So in the long run, most executive orders, by governors and others, are actually found to be unconstitutional. They're not legally binding. They can't stand on their own. They're just things that can be temporarily enforced until that particular matter is addressed in the courts. So executive orders and we've seen more and more of this in the past years, and this year like never before, we've seen all these executive orders and mandates coming from these leaders who are in positions of executive offices, but they're not laws. They've never been legislated. And because in law form, these types of mandates would be found unconstitutional civil liberty and civil rights violations in any countries. that have free democratic constitutional republics, especially in America. So this tyranny operates essentially by bullying the public accommodation space. That's we're talking about businesses, agencies, public service things, anything from restaurants to movie theaters to the DMV, this public accommodation space, into mandating that people they serve into acquiescence regarding their mandated so-called suggestions. This is what some are now calling soft totalitarianism. People across the world are bending to the fear of medical tyranny, having been subjected to wearing slave masks, are being compelled to take an mRNA injection, which can compromise your DNA, the very fabric of humanity, and very soon this will all culminate in the mark of the beast itself. Very likely all without ever becoming official laws, because this new tyranny is basically just bullying the court of public opinion into total submission with what has been dubbed cancel culture. You can't be a part of society, buy or sell or trade, etc., unless you do what we say, even if what we say isn't officially backed up by any laws. As far as I know, in any legislature yet, there are some in New York that are trying to get passed right now. But as far as I know, throughout the entire country, there's not a single actual law that's been passed that can mandate anybody to do any of these things. There's no legislature, there's no law to actually do it. It's just executive order, it's mandates. So I believe that since the Antichrist has such a short time, he's only going to have a 7-year tribulation period, that this is the play. This is the play, because laws take a long time to legislate. That's why the wicked left. They don't like that, so they like to legislate from the bench. That's trying to force legislation effectively by the judiciary branch. They try to legislate that way, and they try to, when they're in power, then they try to use executive orders to last as long as possible while they await challenges in the courts. And so we can also see the cowardice of the judicial branch also that doesn't want to stand up to this in the first place. So we can see all that happening right now. This is all happening, but it's one way that I believe the whole mark of the beast system and everything can come in just by bullying, fear, intimidation in the public accommodation space without ever actually officially becoming laws. And that's one thing that always bothered me about how it was going to happen so fast, but now you can see it very clearly that it is happening, and that's the way they're doing it. Now, in back to 1 Samuel chapter 21 verse 7, it says, "Now one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. And David said to Ahimelech, Now is there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent. And the priest said, The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it for yourself, take it." So this is, David killing Goliath with his own sword. He beheads him with his own sword. The sword of Goliath is kind of like a picture or a model of the cross. It's like the ultimate weapon of the enemy. Fear and terror. We're going to crucify you on the cross. But we know that Jesus actually used the cross, going to the cross himself, paying for our sins, the big, horrible, intimidating weapon of the enemy, this crucifixion, this brutal murder and judgment that Christ underwent. The very cross that was this big intimidating weapon is actually the very thing that has been used to chop Satan's head, so to speak, off. So that's what we're talking about here, is that during the time of Saul's reign, when David is under threat, when David is being chased down and Saul is trying to kill him and his people, here you see that David takes the weapon of the enemy, the cross, and it's actually the thing that brings victory. And of course here, notice that the enemy throughout this time is Doeg the Edomite. And so you'll see that over and over again. Doeg the Edomite, all throughout this passage, Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. So we know that during the time of the tribulation, we know that the Antichrist's appointees, here prefigured as an Edomite, are going to be killing any true people who are holding to true spirituality or true religious precepts, particularly the tribulation saints. Okay, and then of course, here in Obadiah, which is all about Edom and Edomites, because of your violence to your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame, and you will be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates, you cast lots for Jerusalem. You too were as one of them. Do not gloat over your brother's day, the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the sons of Judah in the day of their destruction. Yes, do not boast in the day of their distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their disaster. Yes, you do not gloat over their calamity in the day of their disaster, and do not loot their wealth in the day of their disaster. And do not stand at the fork of the road to cut down their fugitives, and do not imprison their survivors in the day of their distress. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau will be as stubble, and they will set them on fire and consume them, so that there will be no survivor of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. So once the end of the tribulation happens, we are going to see the false prophet, who very likely will be an Edomite bloodline. He will be thrown into the lake of fire that consumes him for eternity, and there will be no survivor of that bloodline. And then, of course, in 2 Thessalonians, do you not remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things, and you know what restrains him now, so that in his time he may be revealed, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth, and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. That is the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all power and signs and false wonders, and with all the deception of the wickedness for those who perish, because they did not receive the love of truth so as to be saved. And for this reason God will send upon them a deluding influence, so that they might believe what is false, in order that they all may be judged who did not believe the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness. And so, again, it's just the reality. Here's the prophecy, and then 2 Thessalonians is talking about the reality of that happening. And finally, last but not least, here we see that Saul disguised himself by putting on other clothes, and he goes to consult the medium to bring up Samuel from the medium. And we see here that when Samuel was brought up, the woman saw Samuel. She cried out with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, "Why have you deceived me? For you are Saul." And here in Obadiah, in verse 7, it says, "All the men allied with you will send you forth to the border, and the men at peace with you will deceive you and overpower you. They who eat your bread will set an ambush for you. There is no understanding in him." So again, you see that same deception that's going to transpire between the wicked and those that they've tried to deceive. They're going to end up being the ones who are the victims of deceit. And then again, we see here in 2 Thessalonians 2:10, "And with all the deception of wickedness for those who perish, because they do not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved. And for this reason God will send upon them a deluding influence," that great deception, "so they might believe what is false, in order that they all may be judged who did not believe the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness." And we're already seeing that currently, right now, in our own society. We're seeing it right now as we speak. We're seeing the, who knows how much, half the world at least or more, believing this in this past year. A host of lies and deceit, different levels of lies and different levels of deceit, and different levels of people are already believing all the deceit that's happening in the world that is so prevalent. It's almost impossible to derive or discern any truth other than the truth of Christ, because the media and social media and all these other things are just rife with lies and deceit of all types. And so the hour is late, and it is growing later and later with each passing day. And the time is now to accept Jesus Christ. If you're watching this and you have not accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, I pray and compel that you would consider doing that now. Just pray to Him, talk to Him, express your contrite heart and your sorrow over the sins and transgressions that you've committed. Acknowledge and admit them before Him by name, all the ones that you remember, and then simply ask for His forgiveness and ask for Him to come into your heart. You can do it in the privacy of your own home. Just It's the easiest thing in the world to be saved if you just overcome your pride. And so I pray that people would do that, and who need to do that, and those who are already saved, that you would be prayed up, repented up, looking up, because we're going up soon. The time is short. Get ready for his return. And while we're waiting, I would highly encourage anybody to start home fellowships, encourage your family, neighbors, friends, acquaintances, colleagues, anybody that you know to come and join you in fellowship. You can show these videos, show any videos you can find on YouTube or download them. Start home fellowships, start prayer fellowships with people that you know, and start getting ready in a grassroots type of way for the return of the Lord, because it's coming very soon. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next video.